We'll just have to continue to keep monitoring the situation, Tom. We've had the bubble announced with New Zealand. It comes into place on the 19th of this month, which is great news, and we'll continue to monitor how other countries are going. And then if we can create further bubbles, then that would be a really good thing, but we'll just have to wait and see. We're dealing with a pandemic. Some countries are going into third lockdowns because of third waves. Here in Australia, through the management of it, we've managed to be in a position where we've got our first bubble about to start, and hopefully there'll be more to come as we continue the vaccine rollout.
But we know the sort of broader opening of borders was always dependent on vaccination. The vaccination comes later. The opening has to come later as well, doesn't it?
Well, we've always sort of envisaged a staged approach to how we would open the international border. So we'll obviously have to wait and see and continue to monitor the situation.
But that logic does hold, doesn't it? Staged approach, whatever it is, whenever that starts, all the stages, everything gets pushed back.
Well, obviously we're ramping up the vaccine at the moment. CSL, through their domestic production, are ramping that up. So we'll continue. We'll nearly be 1 million Australians vaccinated as of today, or there probably will be 1 million. So we're starting to ramp that up. So we'll continue to see how that domestic production goes. Obviously now we need Pfizer for those under 50s. So we'll continue to monitor the situation, see how other countries are progressing. But the most important thing is that we keep Australians safe, we keep Australians secure, and that's been our strategy right along, and that will inform first and foremost the decisions that we take.
So the principle on opening borders, what is the principle? Is it until, for example, everyone in the country's been offered a vaccine, the borders wouldn't be open?
Well, I mean, we can look at it of what has happened here in Australia and how many people have been vaccinated here, but it also is very much dependent on what's happening globally as well. I mean, one of the things we will have to monitor for is new strains. So it's very hard in a pandemic to set down pure policy and pure procedures. What we've got to do is continue to take the medical advice and then work with other countries to how they're going, where their vaccine rollout is. And it might be that you would look at various parts of your economy that you would look to maybe open up. So whether you might
students,
well, the international students, obviously business travel becomes important too. So there is those aspects too that you would also.
So someone
assess.
wanting a holiday might be last in the queue under the principle of who can get into the country, for example.
Well, that very much could be the case. I mean, we've obviously got to prioritise what's best for our nation, both economically and, most importantly, on that health front. And that will continue to be what informs us. So protecting lives and livelihoods.
That'd worry people in tourism, that understand you've got to have priorities that will be students and business trips and so on, and then tourism essentially last.
Well, I mean, obviously tourism is important to our economy, but we also have to remember that domestic tourism can help fill the gap when it comes to international tourism, especially if we can get Australians spending when they're taking their trips like they spend when they're overseas. And that's one of the things we've been encouraging with our half-price airfares is what you save on your airfare, make sure you spend on an attraction or going out to dinner at a restaurant or a pub. And that's a message we'll continue to send. And you've got to remember, we're a net exporter of tourism. So Australians not the only place they can go at the moment, or will be New Zealand without quarantining. So what we're going to see is more and more money being spent here domestically.
Right, I mean, it always depends whether Australians go to the same place as international tourists. So looking ahead, when you spoke about it depends not just about our country but other countries, is there a situation, putting the bubbles aside, they're sort of very bespoke arrangements, that we might be open to 50, 60, 70 countries, a big list that are okay, and then a whole lot of lists that are sort of not great and you've got to quarantine, and then others you just can't go to? Is that what you're envisaging, a bit of a traffic light system down the track?
Well, look, all this is obviously under consideration.
But is that type of thing?
Well, I mean, at the moment, what we're looking at, it's a very much a one step at a time approach. So we've got a two-way bubble with New Zealand, which still hasn't commenced. It will commence on the 19th. So that's the first step. Let's see how that goes. Then we've got some other countries who are keen to talk to us about having bubbles, and Singapore is one of those. So I think then let's assess as to what arrangement you might be able to put in place.
But these sorts of ideas, I mean, you must be already trying to plan ahead for different ways to do this.
Oh, there's planning taking place, but I go back to that first point that I made. We're in a pandemic. This is very unusual times. As we've seen, there are countries who you would have thought you might enter into some sort of arrangement with who are now going into a third lockdown and dealing with a third wave. So you've got to remember that you're continually assessing, reassessing and looking at what you can do. And I think the most important thing at this stage is small steps and make sure that they work. And then let's see how we can build on those.
And those other steps with other countries, even if we don't have so-called bubbles, again, looking ahead, where you're wanting a broader policy, is the 14-day quarantine being looked at closely? It's such an impediment for anyone coming all the way to Australia that, you know, there might be a country that isn't zero risk, but they can come here, get a negative test, and a day later get out and spend some money.
So once again, we'd take the expert medical advice on that. But if that expert medical advice said that if you've vaccinated and if a test was held in the first 24 hours and that became a fairly reliable indicator that you're not going to be spreading the virus when you're here in Australia, well then, yeah, absolutely.
It's not zero risk, is it? That's the thing. Are we going to get away from this sort of zero risk to we've got a certain proportion of the population vaccinated, it's not a terrible country, we're willing to wear some risk on this?
Yeah, it won't be zero risk because, as you've seen from returning Australians, there's no zero risk. You know, people are coming back to Australia with the COVID-19, and we've got to be able to deal with this. And that's why we've always said, especially how important it is when it comes to your contact tracing and your testing, to be able to deal with those situations, because you can't have zero risk.
The next vaccine we could get is Novavax. My understanding is we get that from Europe. Could that be blocked the same way AstraZeneca has been?
Well, the European Union have put in an export restriction mechanism, and so there is the ability now that they've got that mechanism in place for them to be able to block vaccines. Well, our hope would be that the EU don't use export restrictions anymore. And one of the positive signs during the week was there seemed to be an indication from the European Union that they are going to move away from using export restrictions. Now,
but that threat's there for Novavax in the same way.
It's there for vaccines.
What about Pfizer? Do we get any Pfizer from Europe?
So we can get Pfizer from Europe. So one of the things that the European Union have said is where companies are honouring all their contractual arrangements within Europe, so meeting all the supply needs there.
That's the reason.
So that seems to be one of the reasons that they're putting forward.
We do get some Pfizer from Europe. Is that happening?
Yes. So we do get some Pfizer from Europe, but because
so if they fall behind, that could be another issue.
Well, I mean, it's this is why the government's decision to produce here in Australia was so important,
and that vaccine right now can't be used for.
Well,
half the population.
But it can be used for over 50s, and as the medical experts have quite clearly told us, that's the part of our population that we want to protect in the first instance, and that's why we've rolled out the vaccine for that part of the population.
Just finally and briefly on China, so Australia essentially believes that Uyghur Muslims are being incarcerated unfairly, that there are forced contraception and sterilisation, mosques are being destroyed, perhaps something even verging on concentration camps. If this were any other country, we'd be having sanctions on China or Chinese officials, wouldn't we?
Well, we've made it very clear that we think that these human rights abuses are completely unacceptable, and we'll continue to make that point and make it with absolute clarity. So, you know, that is the way that we deal with these issues. We're very upfront about it. Well, we will use sanctions in some instances.
Why not this one?
Well, because what we're doing is we're dealing with the mechanisms that we have in place to be able to deal with it, and we've made it very clear. Well, I mean, you know, so you can use various things, but ultimately in the end, it's up to the country where the human rights abuses are taking place to take the action. And that's why we've, you know, made the representations to the Chinese government that we think that they need to stop the human rights abuses that are taking place.
Minister Dan Tehan, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.